Registers of Births and Deaths Bill, second reading.
Now, Mr. Andrew Mitchell. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that the Registers of Births and Deaths Bill be now read a second time. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I must apologise to the House because I have not been a regular attender on Friday sessions over recent years. The last occasion on which I brought a private member's bill to the House was in 1991, in March 1991, and it was the Education Publication of Exam Results Bill, which set up league tables, and it failed to win the support of the House, but it did subsequently, as I think my honourable friend from Christchurch may recall, it did subsequently become government policy. And in those days, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the doyens of Friday sittings were Ian Gow, Nicholas Soames and Michael Brown. And I see that I attended on the 20th of April 1990 and spent 45 minutes speaking about the relative merits of low-volume alcohol drinks being defined as no more than 0.65% alcohol or 1.2% alcohol. And both you and I, Mr. Deputy Speaker, will understand why a speech was required of such length. My purpose today, however, is much more serious, and I want to start by thanking the Minister for his support and interest in this bill. I know that he will have spent much of last night swatting up all the details, a process I well remember from my time as a junior Social Security Minister in the 1990s. And the good news for my honourable friend is that once he reaches the Cabinet, which will not be long delayed in his case, I am sure, he won't have to take bills through the House anymore. He'll have a junior minister to do it for him. And I also want to thank his officials, and in particular Linda Edwards and Saskia Molekamp, who have been extremely helpful in the early stages of drafting and addressing the issues in this bill. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, my championing of this measure will come as no surprise whatsoever to my constituents in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield, who I have the great honour of representing in this place, because our registry office was closed by Birmingham City Council in 2014, a measure they took to save £83,000 of expenditure, which included the lease of a desk in the local library. So much of that expenditure was not actually saved in the way of things. And at the time, the failure to tell the local hospital Good Hope, funeral directors and local GPs caused a considerable fuss. Also at the time, the central Birmingham Registry Office was very overstretched. You had to struggle to get an appointment to register a birth or a death, and was also not well placed for access in terms of parking. And so for my constituents, the removal of the registry office constituted a very considerable inconvenience. And as a result of that, there was a lobby across the town, a lot of campaigning across the town, that the registry office should remain open. And I commend the Birmingham City Council Conservative councillors who, as a group under their outstanding leader, Bobby Alden, have each year since then, in an alternative budget, pledged to reopen it and also make better use of district centres to reduce travel and boost high street activity. The campaign at the time, which I, as the Member of Parliament, and the hard-working councillors in Sutton Coldfield, strongly supported by local residents as well, did not, alas, prevail. And the failure of local government to hear the call from the royal town to stop this closure is one of the reasons why people voted for local democracy. They voted to set up in a referendum the Royal Sutton Coldfield Town Council, which is today one of the largest town councils in the country, if not the largest, under its outstanding leader, Simon Ward. And the reason for the campaign, I want to reiterate this because it's so relevant to this bill, the reason for the campaign from the royal town was that at a often very upsetting time in life, a sad time in life, my constituents had to journey all the way into Birmingham to comply with the necessary registration procedures. Now, the purpose of this bill is to reform the way in which births and deaths are registered in England and Wales, moving from a paper-based system to registration in an electronic register. As it happens, registrars already use an electronic system to register births and deaths, and have done so since 2009, but they are still required to keep paper registers securely in a safe due to the requirements of the current and, I submit, outdated legislation. This bill will remove the duplication of processes. I would like to reassure my honourable friends that my bill does not make any fundamental changes to the current arrangements for registering births and deaths. For example, who is able to provide the information to the registrar, or the information to be recorded in the entry. But it will make a big difference, as I have described, for our constituents. The way in which births and deaths are currently registered dates back, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to 1837. It is much in need of modernisation and the move to digital methods of registration. I hope it may be helpful to the House if I explain how the current system works. All births and deaths which occur in England and Wales are required to be registered by the registrar for the sub-district in which the event occurred by a qualified informant. For example, in the case of a birth, the qualified informant is most usually the child's mother. When registering a birth or death, the registrar will record all the information on an electronic system. Once the registration is complete, the system will generate a paper register page, which is signed by the informant and the registrar. This paper record is then put into a loose-leaf register, which the registrar keeps in a safe. It is this paper record which is the formal record of the event, and from which all certificates are then issued. The changes proposed in my bill would remove the requirement for paper birth and death registers and introduce a single electronic register in which all births and deaths will be registered. This will create This will create a much more efficient and secure system of registration, and the electronic system is already there and used on a daily basis. I give way with great pleasure to my honourable friend for Stourbridge, who, as a distinguished resident in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield, may well recall the events of which I have spoken.
I do indeed recall those events, and troublesome they were at the time. Could you explain under your proposal, will the old birth and death certificates, will they be destroyed or will they be archived?
I thank my honourable friend very much for her intervention. It's a most important point. I will be coming to it, but clause 4 of the bill refers to the very point which she has so wisely made. Currently, Mr. Deputy Speaker, registrars submit copies of all the birth and death entries they have registered in the last quarter to their superintendent registrar via a system of quarterly returns. The superintendent registrar certifies these entries as being true copies of birth and death entries in the registers and forwards them to the Registrar General. This is done electronically using the electronic system. The Registrar General holds a central repository of all births and deaths registered in England and Wales. My bill will remove that administrative burden. With a move to an I will indeed.
I'm grateful by right honourable friend. When the electronic system was introduced, I think it is in 2009, why was a decision then taken by the government not to abandon the hard copy record? Surely the reason for that was because there was a safeguard. Hard copies are an essential safeguard, aren't they?
Well, I'm going to come on to a number of points which my right honourable friend is alluding to, but I think he will be satisfied when he hears about the other provisions of my bill that that point is being properly addressed. Now, with the move to an electronic register, the system of quarterly returns will no longer be necessary. Following the registration of a birth or death in the electronic register, the entry will immediately be available to the Superintendent Registrar and the Registrar General without having to complete the quarterly returns process from the paper registers. The bill amends the Births and Deaths Registration Act 1953 to insert a new section which enables the Minister to make regulations which make provision that a duty to sign the birth or death register is to have the effect as a duty to comply with specified requirements. If an informant complies with those requirements, they are to be treated as having signed the register and to have done so in the presence of the registrar. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the entry in the electronic register will be treated as having been signed by the person who has provided the information relating to a birth or death. For example, the regulations may require a person to sign something other than the register or to provide evidence of their identity. I would like to reassure my honourable friends that these regulations will be made using the affirmative procedure, which requires them to be approved by both Houses of Parliament, and therefore there will be the opportunity to discuss any content of those measures. The provisions in my bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, are the first step in moving to a more modern system of birth and death registration. By removing the requirement for paper registers to be signed in the presence of a registrar, we pave the way for a move to online methods of registration in the future. It will provide more flexibility and allow an informant to provide the particulars of a birth or death online and at a time to suit the individual without having to visit a register office. This will modernise how births and deaths are registered in the future and give the public more choice, but choice to register in person remains, as registry offices and facilities are needed for marriages and civil ceremonies and citizenship. As I am sure my honourable friends will agree, removing the requirement for face-to-face services is particularly relevant and most important at the moment as we deal with the issues of COVID-19 and the pandemic. My right honourable and honourable friends will also be pleased to hear that just these measures in respect of the registration of deaths will save the taxpayer £90 million over 10 years. And the effect of all these measures, in terms of saving money for the taxpayer, is that over the next 10 years, on a conservative basis, we estimate that these measures will save £170 million. And the figure of 20 million, which appears in the explanatory notes, I should just explain, is a reference only to the amount saved by removing the paper register and the requirements for quarterly returns. So the savings to the taxpayer are indeed significant. Now, I turn now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, briefly to the clauses in the bill. Clause 1 amends the original Act of the Births and Deaths Registration Act 1953. The new sections allow the Registrar General to determine how registers of live births and stillbirths and deaths are to be kept. It will now remove the duplication of processes. Now all births and deaths will be registered in an electronic register without the need for paper registers. Clause 2 deals with the provision of equipment and facilities by local authorities. It makes clear that all local authorities must provide and maintain the equipment and facilities set down by the Registrar General for all register and sub-district register offices. And I'm grateful to the Labour spokesman for specifically raising this point in our discussions earlier. Clause 3 is the requirement to sign the register. This is a new power which will bring before the House new regulations in respect of non-paper registration, and where someone complies with specific requirements will be treated as having signed. Obviously, such provisions may require evidence of identity, and those provisions will be up to the House in further legislation that we move in the way that I have described. The clause makes clear that the government can only do this under the affirmative procedure, which, as I said, means any provisions must be laid before and approved by both Houses of Parliament. Clause 4 is about the treatment of existing registers and records, the point made so ably by my honourable friend from Starbridge. It requires the Registrar General to continue to keep and maintain all the existing records. Clause 5 effectively brings the schedules to this bill into effect. Clause 6 is the power to make further consequential provisions, including, if required, to primary legislation, and again, in those circumstances only, this can only be done by affirmative resolution. And Clause 7 is the commencement clause, which comes into force on the day the bill is passed. Finally, the schedule deals with minor and consequential amendments to the original Act and to certain other primary legislation consequent on the provisions of this bill. Mr Deputy Speaker, my bill does not require either a money resolution, my honourable friend from Christchurch will be pleased to hear, nor does it require a Ways and Means resolution. It is also fully compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. And I very much hope that across the House, and indeed in the other place where our late colleague, my noble friend Lord Lancaster of Kimbolton, has agreed to assist in its passage, this bill, with its self-evident benefits for our constituents, will, after further scrutiny, become an act, and I commend its provisions to the House.
The question is that the registers of birth